best prices, guaranteed. It's a promise we made to serve you with the best of all good things. Cause the best of the best deserve the best, and that's just what AFIS brings. No matter where you're stationed, count on us to fill your needs. Best brands, best prices, guaranteed.
AFN Primetime tonight after Dharma and Greg on Titus.
You people are pathetic.
How do you handle a 15-year-old with an attitude?
Call the cops on her like I did you.
Titus. Then Mimi's prank lands Drew in the loony bin.
I don't belong here.
Now Lewis and Oswald want to break him out.
That's why you lifted the janitor's keys.
The Drew Carey Show, followed by ER. AFN Primetime tonight.
Tonight on Destinations.
You think Berlin Wall, anyone in our age group, anyone in our generation. So you see how different it is now from, I mean, we were looking at the postcards where there are like walls up and these warning signs, and now it's just filled with clothing stores and souvenir shops and Mercedes taxis running around. It's really like strange juxtaposition.
As you enter the historic city of Berlin, Germany, one of the first landmarks you'll see is this, the Victory Column of 1873. And it's just one of the many landmarks you'll see tonight here on this edition of Destinations. Good evening, I'm your host, Kane Farabaugh. Thanks for joining us. We're here in Berlin, Germany, on the trail of President George W. Bush's historic state visit to Berlin, Germany. You know, during the Cold War, Berlin was a mandatory stop on any president's itinerary. And tonight, before we begin, we'd like to take a look at some of those historic visits. Berlin was a city in ruin at the end of World War II. From the ashes of war, the people of Berlin were determined to rebuild their city. With help from the Marshall Plan, the city would spend several decades to finally emerge as the thriving metropolis it is today. Located within the Russian zone of occupied Germany, Berlin was divided into 4 sections controlled by the different Allied powers. The Soviets controlled the area which eventually became East Berlin. The French, British, and U.S. controlled what became West Berlin. The first visit by a U.S. president came in 1962 when John Fitzgerald Kennedy spoke to the people of Berlin amid growing U.S.-Soviet tensions.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
Kennedy's words, carried over the Berlin Wall by radio in the Allied sector, or RIAS, would set the stage for future presidential visits. Berlin became a mandatory stop on any U.S. president's foreign itinerary. It served to reassure West Germany continued support against the threat of communism, and many presidents would take the opportunity to criticize the Soviet Union and East Germany's repressive policies in the former occupied city. President Ronald Reagan spoke to the people of Berlin near one of the city's most famous landmarks, the Brandenburg Gate. Beyond it stood the symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Not long after, the wall was torn down, but not by Mr. Gorbachev, but the citizens of Berlin, as the government in East Germany collapsed.
Citizens of free Berlin, citizens of united Germany.
To signal the end of the Cold War and an end to the military presence in Berlin, President Bill Clinton became the first U.S. president to walk through the Brandenburg Gate. In former East Berlin, he spoke of the continued German-American relationship in the post-Cold War era.
In the name of every American president who has come to Berlin, in the name of the American forces who will stay in Europe to guard freedom's future, in all of their names, I say, America steht an ihrer Seite, jetzt und für immer.
President George W. Bush is the latest U.S. president to make history in Berlin. He's the first U.S. president to visit this city as Germany's capital. The government moved here from Bonn in 1999. It's also the first presidential visit to Germany since the September 11th attacks, and comes amid the highest level of security in the city since World War II. Thousands of police were mobilized to watch tens of thousands of protesters. Many of them took to the streets to protest U.S. foreign policy. And Gary Bautell is here to tell us more about how Berliners feel about this latest presidential visit.
For one thing, Kane, with a large part of the inner city closed off, many people were having trouble getting where they wanted to go.
Also könnte ich so über die Nebenstraßen so
Das ist vielleicht möglich.
Alles klar, danke.
Okay, bitte.
Das Problem ist, dass es bis in die Nachmittagsstunden gesperrt ist. Aber wie lange? Also jetzt auch eine Stunde, genau auf die Minute.
And the police, 10,000 of them, were everywhere. In the past, U.S. presidents mixed with the people of Berlin. Not this time. This office worker says he remembers shaking hands with President Kennedy. It was possible in those days to meet a president. Not anymore. Too bad, he said. This resident of Berlin tells us many people just took off from work during the visit, and most people are not happy about the security. It is not excessive, this businessman says. The President of the United States must be protected. People can put up with the precautions for a couple of days. The music student thinks the money that was spent should go for music and cultural programs in the city instead.
Berlin actually has no money, and for a musician or the arts here in Berlin, it's a problem because the politicians close very much of theaters, museums, and so there's no money. And this action here with the president and what's now going on here costs about, I think, 15 million euro. So it's just a little bit, and also the people aren't really happy.
Meanwhile, a few blocks away at the Berlin University, the object of all this protection, the demonstrators gather for their daily march. But it's a bright, sunny day, so many are working on their tans instead. Others have spent a lot of creative energy on their costumes. In fact, the atmosphere was more like a festival than a protest march. Later that night, there were a few clashes with police, but for the most part, Berlin was peaceful, especially the government district where Kane Farabaugh is taking in the sights.
This is the residence of German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. It's located in the government center of Berlin. Most of the structures here in the government center are fairly new, having been built in just the last several decades. But one structure that's been here for many years has history both old and new, and it's also a stop on President Bush's itinerary. Gary Bautell takes us to that place in this next report. Gary?
Well, Kane, the Reichstag, the German parliament, has long been one of Germany's most important political symbols. And that is especially true today. The refurbished Reichstag is an important tourist attraction. Thousands of people come here every day to see the interior of the building from a huge glass dome atop the structure. And we'll be taking our own look inside the German Reichstag.
Perhaps one reason why the Reichstag is such a popular tourist attraction is its significance as a symbol of democracy during the long years of German division. It stood right against the Berlin Wall, unused and waiting for a united German parliament to once again fill its main assembly hall. Today, it is a totally refurbished building, and once again, democratically elected chancellors such as Gerhard Schroeder address the delegates of the four parties now represented in the parliament. His Social Democrats and coalition partner, the Greens, the main opposition party, the Christian Democratic Union, and the Socialists, the successor party to the former East German Communist Party. Some associate the Reichstag building with the Nazi period, but in fact, the Nazis burned the building and blamed it on the communists in their rise to power. Still, the Germans are very particular as to how they describe the seat of their government. It is the Reichstag building, but the Bundestag, the parliament, meets there. It has been more than a decade since the wall fell, but there is still a sense of amazement among the people who work for the Bundestag.
We are sitting here in a room where it was just 10 meters ahead, the wall was running. I'm sitting here in East Berlin, and I'd never believed in my life that my office will once again be in the eastern city, in the eastern part of Berlin. Today it's completely normal. We are crossing the ancient border as if it would never have been existed.
Hartwig Bierhof's office is indeed on what once was East German territory. We stood on the east side of the plaque on the ground where the wall once stood. Now only an unpleasant memory. At the Bundestag in Berlin, I'm Gary Bautell.
Booking official U.S. Army Europe or leisure travel has never been so easy. Log on to www.satotravel.com/user and book your vacation or official travel via the net. No waiting, no lines. When there's a mission to accomplish, your time is essential. www.satotravel.com/user allows you to reserve leisure or official travel from anywhere in Europe 24 hours a day.
President Bush's state visit made news all over the world, but when all those cameras go away and the spotlight fades, there's at least one American who's still here in Germany and still very interested in what's going on. And that person is the U.S. ambassador to Germany. It's an historic role, one first filled more than 200 years ago by former President John Quincy Adams. And it's one that's now filled by former Indiana Senator Dan Coates. And Gary Bautell had a chance to sit down and talk with him right before the president's visit. Gary?
Thanks, Kane. We're here at the U.S. Embassy in Berlin. In fact, we're in the office of the ambassador to Germany, Dan Coates. Mr. Coates, thank you very much for taking time to be with us today on Destinations.
My pleasure.
This is an exciting time for Berlin, isn't it?
Very exciting. The President, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor are all coming for important reasons and discussions with German officials, but most importantly for the President to deliver a major foreign policy address, not only to Germany, but to Europe as a whole.
Berlin is indeed a very changed city. It's evolving almost every day. And were you ever here during the Cold War as a senator?
I was here during the Cold War, and to see the change is remarkable. For those who had the opportunity to see Berlin when it was a divided city, and to see the difference between freedom in the West and totalitarianism in the East, ought to come now and see the remarkable change that has taken place.
And for the U.S. Embassy, it's also a time of change. I guess it's still one of the largest embassy staffs in the world, but you're spread all over, right?
Unfortunately, we are spread in 4 locations here in Berlin. We can't consolidate in one until we build our new embassy. We just announced a formal agreement with the city of Berlin, ending years of debate and negotiation and discussion over security issues and location issues. So all that now kicks in the process of starting work on the new embassy, and it will be started next year after finalizing some architectural details, and then completed in a couple of years, 2-3 years after that. We look forward to bringing everybody under one roof. We'll be occupying one of the most historic spots in Germany right next to the Brandenburg Gate. And we will finally have an embassy here that I think truly symbolizes the importance of U.S. presence in Germany.
I know that security has always been a great concern, and that's been primarily one of the reasons there has been some delay. But and we see it today, especially with the visit. But is there really that serious a terrorist threat? Is the United States more the target, or is Europe? What is your perception on that?
Well, my perception is that in this uncertain era of terrorist activity that we find ourselves, American interests, American presence, whether it's in Europe or other parts of the world, are going to be potential targets, and I emphasize the word potential. We have very good security here in Germany. They're very diligent about the question of the impact of terrorism on American interests, and they provide us very good security. But Americans, I think, need to understand that when they're abroad, in particular, they are potential targets for terrorist messages and terrorist attacks.
So the American forces gone from their Cold War role to doing just about all kinds of missions out of Germany, humanitarian, peacekeeping, training. It's been a base into Africa, into the Balkans, everywhere. What do you foresee is going to be the U.S. military role in Germany?
Well, I think we'll always have a very substantial presence here militarily. It has changed since the fall of the wall in terms of a more defensive posture in protecting Germany from invasion from the east. But it is now a base of operations for, as you said, humanitarian, peacekeeping, security support, and even situations like what we found ourselves in the Gulf and now in Afghanistan. And so Germany remains a staging ground, remains a base of operations for that type of support, and an integral part of NATO in the defense of Europe. So there will always be a very important role for U.S. presence in Germany, and fortunately our German hosts understand that, agree with that, and want us to be here.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for being with us on Destinations.
Thank you.
Don't miss out. Visit School Aid Services to check out what they offer.
AFN remote units are constantly on assignment to cover stories whenever and wherever they occur. AFN reporters interview visiting dignitaries, statesmen, celebrities. They cover the events of the day to bring to their listeners a sense of being there as news is happening. From Checkpoint Charlie, a remote report is taped for a later news broadcast.
Today we are at Checkpoint Charlie on Friedrichstrasse here in Berlin. 17 months later, after the Wall of Shame was erected dividing East and West Berlin. Today it has been fairly quiet and it is a fairly cold day. And as we look across the wall, we can see the characteristic red and white checkered barriers that dot the area between East.
One obvious sign Berlin's come a long way in the past 13 years is where I'm standing right now. This used to be United States Army Checkpoint Charlie, and during the Cold War, this was the last spot Americans would pass through before they entered East Germany. Well, it's no longer the frontier of freedom. Now it's a tourist attraction right in the center of Berlin. Just by looking around, you wouldn't think this was once a Cold War outpost. Instead of armed guards and gates, there are now souvenir shops and tourists. Hundreds of people each day make the pilgrimage to Checkpoint Charlie, including dozens of Americans on vacation in Europe.
The name definitely sounded familiar, but we just wanted to see what it was like.
Jonathan Roth recently graduated from college and is about to enter the U.S. Navy as a medical officer. He was backpacking through Europe when we caught up with him at what was once the front line of the Cold War.
I thought it was going to be somewhat bigger and more monumental, but I think it's nice that they still kept it intact and it's still there for the memory of, I guess, what had happened, and even when they tore down the wall, it's still there just so you can come back and see it and remember history.
In fact, not only can you see parts of the Berlin Wall, you can actually buy them. Several of the souvenir shops and stands near Checkpoint Charlie sell pieces of the Berlin Wall. Just across the street from the checkpoint replica is the Checkpoint Charlie Museum. Many of the pictures and items on display give visitors a sense of the tensions and danger that once existed here.
You see how different it is now from, I mean, we were looking at the postcards where there are like walls up and these warning signs, and now it's just filled with clothing stores and souvenir shops and Mercedes taxis running around. It's really like a strange juxtaposition. So I don't know if it was necessarily a tourist attraction, but it was definitely something I think most people should want to see if they come to Berlin. I mean, you think Berlin Wall, anyone in our age group, anyone in our generation, so.
On August 13th, 1961, the first barbed wire entanglements of the Berlin Wall went up. Soon after that, the Berlin Wall as it looks today was erected. Now, 28 years later, all that is changing.
Checkpoint Charlie was a hole in the wall, literally. That wall was the most famous symbol of the Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and all that stands of it right now is right behind me. It's a place where history has not yet been totally rewritten. It's now a canvas for graffiti artists, but where I'm standing used to be no man's land, and during the Cold War, if you found yourself caught here, chances are you wouldn't have been here for long. The only section of the original Berlin Wall that still stands is located in the easternmost part of the city. It stands now as a living art gallery. Hundreds of murals profile the works of different artists protesting the separation of East and West Germany. Most of the murals here are restored to their original condition after years of abuse by graffiti artists. In what was once no man's land, a construction company is getting ready to develop this area, another sign that Berlin's come a long way since its place in history as the front line of the Cold War. Well, we're just about done with tonight's edition of Destinations, and I bet you're probably wondering why you haven't seen the most famous landmark in Berlin, the Brandenburg Gate. Well, there's an easy answer for that. That's why. There's nothing to see, and that's because the entire structure is under canvas as a private industry works to completely restore the Brandenburg Gate. Thanks for joining us here tonight on Destinations. If you've got a story near you you'd like us to cover, it's easy to get in touch with us. All you have to do is send us an email. The email address is destinations@afn.frankfurt.army.mil. We'd love to hear from you. I'm your host each and every week right here on Destinations, Kane Farabaugh. Have a good evening.